This is NECO 2021 General Mathematics Paper 2, and we are answering question number 12. And the question reads, the scores of 30 students in a biology test are given below. These are the scores: 40, 74, 12, 27. Up to the last score, which is 32. These are the scores of 30 students in a biology test. So the question asked is number A. Construct a frequency table using the class intervals 1 to 20, 21 to 40, and so on. Question number B, you asked to use the assumed mean of 30.5 to calculate the standard deviation of this very distribution. So let's attempt to answer this very question to get the solution to the problem, starting with the very first question that asked to construct a frequency table for this distribution, but we have samples class intervals to use, the 1 to 20, 21 to 40. So I'm going to have my table like this. The first column will now contain the scores, and the next column will now contains the frequency. So that the scores I have 1 to 20, 21 to 40. These are just the sample 2 given, which you can now use to generate the rest. So the next one is going to be 41 to 60, 61 to 80, 81 to 100. So I'll go back to my raw data. What I'm going to do, I'll now find out how many numbers are in between 1 and 20. That gives me the frequency of those numbers in this group. So striking all those numbers that are in between 1 and 20, if you count those numbers that are struck with this red line, you discover that they are 7 in number. So you now have 7 as the frequency. I'll move to the next class interval, that is 21 to 40. So I'm going to strike all those numbers from here that are in between 21 and 40, and I'll count how many numbers that I have struck. So using brown line to strike those numbers, because initially I used red lines for numbers 1 to 20. So I'm now using brown line to strike all those numbers between 21 and 40. If you count those numbers after the last with a brown line struck, you discover that they are 13 in number. So you now have the frequency of 21 to 40 as 13. So I'll continue. So I'll move to the next class interval, 41 to 60. I'm going to strike all those numbers that fall between 21 and 60. This time around, I'm now going to use the yellow line, striking all those numbers in between 41 and 60. If you count them correctly, you have 5 of them. So the frequency will now be 5. So I'll move to the next class interval, 61 to 80. 61 to 80, I'm going to use another color to strike all those numbers that fall between 61 and 80. If you do it correctly, you now have 4 numbers with this blue line: 74, 77, 65, 64. Look at them. They are 4 in number, so the frequency will now be 4. And what remains, the number that was not struck, is only this number 90. It is the number that fall in between 81 and 100. Therefore, the frequency will now be 1. If you want to make sure what you have done is correct, you can now add those frequencies. If it gives you the number 30 back, then you are now sure that what you did is correct. So with this, I have answered question number A, that is constructing frequency table. So that answered the question number A. So we'll move to question number B that asked to find, to calculate the standard deviation using the assumed mean of 30.5. So what I'm going to do first is to write down the formula for finding standard deviation. Standard deviation is given by the formula SD equals to square root of, inside the square root you now have summation f d square over summation f minus bracket open, inside the bracket is summation f d all over summation f, and the bracket raised to the power of 2. This is the formula we use to find the standard deviation of grouped data. So from this formula, I can see I have a variable d, I have a variable d square, I have fd, I have fd square, which means I have to get 2 columns for each. So starting with the d, to find the d, you have to have what we call x bar, because d simply refers to deviation. You are using the class mid value of a grouped data to find the deviation. So I'm going to have x bar first, a column for it. Then I have a column for d. Then I can now have a column for D square, then FD square, then my FD. These are the columns that I have introduced that I have to get to them all before I come back to this my formula. So starting with the class mid value, that is the X bar. This class mid value simply refers to the middle score of each class interval. To find the middle score in this class interval 1 to 20, you add 1 and 20 to get 21 and divide the result by 2. That gives you 10.5. Next class mid value now be 21 plus 40 to get 61. 61 divided by 2, that gives 30.5. Next class mid value 41 plus 60, 101 divided by 2 is 50.5. Next is 61 plus 80, divide the result by 2, you now have 70.5. Next 81 plus 100 divided the result by 2, that gives answer 90.5. These are my class mid values. It is this that I'm going to use to obtain D, that is the deviation. Starting with the very first deviation, I'm going to use this assumed mean 30.5 and this class mid value. So I'm going to see the class mid value minus the assumed mean. So I have 10.5 minus 30.5. That gives minus the 20 as your first deviation. Next, I'm going to take the next class mid value 30.5 minus the assumed mean, which is 30.5. So you subtract, you have 0. So next class mid value 50.5 minus 30.5, that gives answer 20. Next 70.5 minus 30.5, that gives answer 40. And the last 90.5 minus 30.5, that gives answer the 60. So you now square each of this deviation to populate this column D square. So minus 20 square is 400, 0 square is 0, 20 square is 400, 40 square is 1600, and 60 square is 3600. So I'll now get to FD square, the column FD square. So I'm going to take each and every F, multiply by its corresponding D square. So I have 7 times 400, that gives 2800. 13 times 0, that gives answer 0. 5 times 400, that gives answer 2000. 4 times 1600, that gives answer 6400. And 1 times 3600, that gives answer 3600. Also find this FD. So I'm going to take each and every F multiplied by its corresponding D. So I'm going to have 7 times minus 20, that gives answer minus 140. 13 times 0 is 0. 5 times 20, that gives answer 100. 4 times 40, that gives answer 160. And 1 times 60, that gives answer 60. So I have all the columns filled. So what remains is to look at this very formula. I need to have summation FD square. So I'm going to add all the entries in this column. I'm going to have summation FD. I'm going to add all the entries in this column as well. So the addition of FD square, summation of all the FD square, if you did correctly, you have 14,800. And the summation of FD, if you did correctly, you have 180. Summation of F is, of course, the 30. That is the total number of data you have. So I will now substitute in this very formula. I have my summation FD square as 14,800 and the summation FD as 180. So substituting correctly, you now have square root of 14,800 divided by 30 minus open bracket inside the bracket is 180 minus 30. 180 is summation FD and summation F is 30. Then that bracket raised to the power of 2. Is 180 divided by 30 gives answer 6, and 6 square is now 36. And dividing 14,800 by 30 correctly gives answer 493.3. So I'll now subtract 36 from 493 and take the square root. If that is done correctly, you now have 21.38 as the final answer. So this is the standard deviation of this very distribution, and that answered all the questions. So let me just share with you quickly the mark distribution for this very question as it is there in the marking scheme. The very first mark is a bonus 1 mark, and this bonus 1 mark is for getting the frequencies correct, all correct. You have this bonus 1 mark. Next mark is another bonus 1 mark for getting the class mid value correctly. that is 10.5, 30.5 up to the last one. If all are correct, you have this bonus 1 mark. Next mark is finding f d square, that is multiplying f by its corresponding d square. If you do that correctly, you have this method 1 mark, and if you have all the entries correct, you have this accuracy 1 mark. Next mark is another method 1 mark is for getting fd, that is multiplying f by its corresponding d. You have this method 1 mark, and if all the multiplications are correct, you have this accuracy 1 mark. Next mark is substituting in the formula for finding standard deviation. That is your summation fd square, your summation fd, and your summation f. If you do that correctly, you have this method 1 mark. And when you now simplify up to the n, where you now take square root, you have this method 1 mark. And when you now have the standard deviation exactly as 21.38 correctly, you have this accuracy 1 mark. So if everything is done correct in this very question, you have 10 good marks.